Today I'd like to talk to you about love. That is the love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the great love chapter of the Bible. And at the end of that chapter, Paul says, these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But then adds, but the greatest of these is love. How would we define these? Well, I would say faith is believing God. Hope is expecting God. Love is experiencing God. And put it another way, as we will see in the next few minutes, love is forfeiting vengeance. It's kissing vengeance goodbye. It is letting God vindicate you. Love is choosing the honor and praise that comes from God. And love is totally forgiving those who have hurt you and maybe who wanted to destroy you. And instead of trying to get vengeance, you love them, you forgive them, you even pray for them. Well, love is a choice. I have to tell you right now, I have a teaching which I call total forgiveness. It's based a lot on this chapter, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I want to make this point, that total forgiveness, or the love described in 1 Corinthians 13, it's a choice. It's a choice we make. It is an act of the will. Don't wait for God to knock you down. It's not going to come that way. You choose to love. The result, you experience God. For God is love. Now, at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 13, what Paul does is to give a comparison of love vis-a-vis the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 to 10, Paul refers to what is commonly referred to as the 9 gifts of the Spirit. That's a bit misleading because the truth is there are more than 9. But let me give you what these are. In 1 Corinthians 12, verse 8, there's the one called word of knowledge, word of knowledge, word of wisdom. There is wisdom, there is faith, healing, miraculous powers, prophecy, discerning of spirits, speaking different kinds of tongues. And then when Paul begins 1 Corinthians 13, he implicitly refers to those gifts. And he says that if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And so in the beginning of this great chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, I wish if it were you're able to do it, you could go get a Bible right now and turn to 1 Corinthians 13, because Paul introduces this great chapter by comparing love to 3 of the gifts of the Spirit of 1 Corinthians 12. One is tongues. The other is prophecy. The other is faith. And I've always thought it's rather odd that Paul would throw faith into the mixture when we talk about the gifts of the Spirit, because surely we're saved by faith. Saving faith is what gets you to heaven. And I talk a lot about persistent faith. But when Paul says there remains faith, hope, love, and then mentions faith in 1 Corinthians 12, he's not talking about saving faith. He's not talking about persistent faith. It's more likely an instantaneous gift in a desperate situation when you are suddenly given extraordinary faith in a moment. Well, the point is, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 3 gives an example of this. And he says, if I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I am nothing. That would be a most extraordinary kind of faith. And he also talks about if you've got faith so that you could you would master knowledge. You understand all mysteries, and you could even move mountains. You can move mountains. He says you can have that without faith. Without love. And if you can do those things without love, it just shows that you ought to lower your voice and think that you've done something extraordinary because you have a gift of word of knowledge or wisdom or prophecy or faith that you can move mountains. Paul says, if you have all those things and don't have love, even when you are willing to give all you have to the poor. And by the way, the early church did this, and they had a taste of such detachment from earthly things that they just sold their property, gave all the money to the church. They did that. Paul says you can do that without love. He does. He says that. When you are willing to surrender your body to the flames, he said, you can do that and not have love. And so here's the point. Paul says there's faith, hope, love, but the greatest is love. So Paul says that love, listen to me, this love is greater than extraordinary faith. In fact, he says, if I don't have love, I am nothing. Listen to this. I am nothing if I don't have this love. I gain nothing, he says in verse 3, if I don't have this love. So I want to talk to you about the content of 1 Corinthians 13, and he shows what love is and what love does. Also shows what it isn't and what it doesn't do in these verses. Well, what love is and what it is not. Let's look at that in a moment. What it is, he says, it is patient and kind. You know, in that moment, I feel convicted. Well, I'm just reminded to have love means you've got patience. And immediately I am convicted. Paul said to the Hebrew Christians, or whoever wrote Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 10, he says, you've got need of patience. Well, when I read that, I thought, that's me. And then he says, love is patient, love is kind. And I have to come clean. I so often feel that that's not me. I want it to be me. Maybe now and then I might have a touch of it. But what we have here is a passage of Scripture that would convict most of us. It's patience, it's kindness. And then he says what it isn't. It's not rude. It's not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not proud. It is not easily angered. And when I read that, I think, oh dear, I feel so many times I've spoken rudely over the telephone. I can talk to an airline person when I'm trying to book a flight, and they seemed like they haven't worked there till today, and they don't know what they're doing. And if I'm not careful, I start to say something, and Louise will say, don't say anything. Be careful what you say. Look here. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is a verse that I found convicting. I made a decision some years ago to read 1 Corinthians 13 every day for a year on my knees. I did it for a year. Read this chapter every day for 1 year on my knees. And you may ask, did I end up with this love? Possibly not. We're talking about a very, very high standard here. This is why Paul could say the greatest of all these, faith, hope, love, is love. Think about it. Not easily angered, not proud. Now, another thing about this great chapter is how we know that Joseph forgave his brothers at the time he was in the dungeon. There will be some of you watching who have heard me talk about this. A lot of my friends have heard it, and if you've heard me very many times, you may have heard me say some of this. But for those who don't know the story, Joseph, who was one of 12 sons of Jacob. Jacob is also called Israel. Israel, Jacob, had 12 sons. One of them was Joseph. And he was partial to Joseph. Not right, not good, but he was. And made the other brothers jealous of Joseph. You can't really blame them. What happened is that they could take no more of Joseph's arrogance, and they were going to kill him, sadly. But by providence, some Ishmaelites were turned up, and they said, let's not kill our brother, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. They did, never expecting to see Joseph again. Jacob had made a coat of many colors for Joseph. And the first thing those brothers did is to yank that coat of many colors off Joseph's back. They dipped it in blood, and then they sent it to Jacob. They didn't take it, they sent it. And they said, we found this, do you recognize it? Well, Joseph was now on his way to where the Ishmaelites were taking him. And Jacob sees this coat of many colors, and he says, it's Joseph's. A wild beast has devoured him. I'll go to my grave in mourning. Well, Jacob was convinced he would never see Joseph again. The 11 brothers, actually it was only 10, that's another story. The point is, these brothers never thought they would see Joseph again. Well, the Ishmaelites take him to Egypt and sell Joseph to an Egyptian officer by the name of Potiphar. And Joseph, who had never worked a day in his life, is now a slave in Potiphar's house. But God was with Joseph and advanced him. And after a while, Joseph is made the head of the household. But then there was a trial coming up Joseph wasn't counting on. And that is that Potiphar's wife began to flirt with Joseph. She became attracted to him. We're told that Joseph was handsome, well-built, and this was a fashionable officer's wife. We don't know where her husband was, but she now begins to flirt with Joseph and says, go to bed with me. He wouldn't do it, and she would try day after day after day. And he ran one day, and she grabbed part of his coat, his cloak, used it as evidence. And when her husband came home and said, that Hebrew that you hired to be a manager of our household today tried to rape me, blatant lie, horrible lie. Potiphar believed her, or at least had to act like he did. And the next thing you know, Joseph is in a dungeon. And while he's in the dungeon, he does some hard praying. I don't know what he said at first. He might have said, thanks a lot, God. I do the right thing. I resist sexual temptation. And by the way, could I say parenthetically before I go any further, it's only a matter of time that every chosen vessel of God will be tempted. It's only a matter of time that everybody's going to be tempted at this level. Sexual temptation. It's the most natural temptation there is. We're made this way. But the Bible says sex is for marriage alone, between a man and a woman. Well, Joseph was single. Potiphar's wife flirts with Joseph. He could have said, well, now look here, I don't deserve to be here. My brothers betrayed me. How could God let this happen? Nobody in Egypt's going to find out because she's not going to tell her husband. Nobody back in Canaan will find out. And he might have said, I'm entitled to a little bit of fun. He might have said that. But you know what? He said no. He said no. It was not easy. He ran. Why did he run? It was not easy. It was not easy. But in that moment, the angel said yes. Joseph could not have known that it was earmarked for greatness. He could not have known that one day he would be prime minister of Egypt. But all he knew at the time that he was tempted, and then the thanks he gets for resisting sexual temptation, he's now in a dungeon. He's in prison. And it is so sad. It is so unfair. And so what does Joseph do? Does he say, thanks a lot, God? No, he didn't. We're told that the Lord was with Joseph. I've got to say one other thing before I move any further. I think there's somebody watching me right now. You, as I speak, are in the middle of an affair, having it right now. And you think you're going to get away with it. You think that you're the exception. You're going to get away with it. I've got this word for you. I would urge you right now, listen to me. Stop it. Stop it. It's only a matter of time. You would give 1,000 worlds to turn the clock back to this moment. Give it up. Stop it now. One day you'll be so glad you did. Well, here's the thing. Joseph resisted, and he's in prison. And maybe you've done the right thing lately. You've honored God, and then greater trial comes. And it's not fun when a trial like that comes, and it's very, very hard. Well, what we know is Joseph passed the test. But what we also know that it was while he was in prison that he finally forgave his brothers. And I'm going to show you how I've come to that conclusion. While he was in prison, here's what happens. After he's there a while, two people are put in prison. One was the king's baker, and the other was the cupbearer to the king. And each of them had a dream. And well, when they had dreams, Joseph, his face lit up. He said, tell me the dreams, because Joseph, this was one of his gifts, was interpreting dreams. This is, you could say, his main gift. Dreams and dream interpretation. That was Joseph. And here's two people in prison with him. They've got dreams. Joseph says, tell me. Well, the cupbearer to the king gives his dream, and Joseph says, good news. You will get your job back in 3 days. To the baker, not so good. Sorry about that. In 3 days, you're going to lose your life. But as to the cupbearer to the king, as soon as Joseph gave the interpretation to the cupbearer, he did something that you could sympathize with. You can't blame him. But here's what he said. Remember me. He says, when you get out of prison, because you're going to get your job back in 3 days, remember me. Tell the Pharaoh, I'm in this prison. I don't deserve to be here. I've done nothing wrong. What Joseph is doing is trying to manipulate his way out. And I think God looked down from heaven and said, oh, Joseph, sorry about this. You're going to need a couple more years here. But I think one day, one thing that happened is that Joseph finally forgave his brothers. I think it happened then. And I'll tell you why I say that. Because 1 Corinthians 13 says that love is not self-seeking. You see, as long as Joseph was trying to play man the manipulator and get his way out of prison and say to the butler, cupbearer to the king, when you get your job back, tell Pharaoh about me, God says, you're not ready yet. Because God wanted Joseph to come to the place that he totally forgave his brothers and not be promoted until he was ready. I think one day God looked down and saw that Joseph was a changed man. He was a new man. And God could look down and say, Joseph, I think you're ready now. My chief mentor was Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. He said something to me I'll never forget, arguably the greatest word, just about the greatest word, that anybody ever gave me. He said, the worst thing that can happen to a man is to succeed before he's ready. Well, now, God had plans for Joseph. Oh, big plans, huge plans. But Joseph wasn't ready. And the proof that you will not succeed before you're ready is that you are still filled with bitterness and anger. But when you are governed by love and total forgiveness, and this has become a lifestyle, it's just maybe then you can be trusted. Governed by love, governed by total forgiveness. You know, I look at situation in the world today, whether in the church, politics, so much where people are in prominence. They're angry. They go into politics, they're angry. They get a chance to be prestigious, and they're using their position and to get rid of certain people or to put them down. I'll tell you who God is looking for. He's looking for somebody out there devoid of bitterness. Somebody out there who can resist sexual temptation. He's looking for somebody out there who has totally forgiven his enemy. And Joseph wasn't ready at first, but he got ready. And maybe you haven't been ready. Just listen to me. Maybe God will use this little time right now. Maybe you and I will never meet. But if I could just say something that would make a difference in your life, perhaps you've been called to greatness. Who knows what God has in mind for you down the road? And I would urge you to listen to my little exposition or talk on 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You see, Paul says love is not easily angered. Paul does not say it keeps you from anger. No, if only. But when you walk in love, you are less likely to lose your temper. When you walk in total forgiveness, doesn't mean you're going to be perfect, but you are less likely to lose your temper. Well, let me explain what love doesn't do. Says Paul, it does not envy. So it's another way of saying, when you feel jealousy, mark it down, that didn't come from God. Sometimes jealousy wells up in us, and if we're not careful, we'll think God has given me this feeling toward this person, and you want to get rid of them, or you want to put them down, or you want to see them punished. Jealousy doesn't come from God. Envy doesn't come from God. Love does not boast. Listen to me. When you're wanting to brag on yourself, brag on your accomplishments, mark it down. That desire to boast did not come from God. And then here's the statement that gets all of us. This is the hard one. This is the hard one. Says Paul, love does not keep a record of wrongs. In my view, this is probably the strongest statement about love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. For example, why do we keep records? Why do we keep records at all? Well, to show we paid. We keep a record. We ask for a receipt. We keep a record. But then why do we keep a record of a wrong? Maybe in our minds. Not that we write it down, but in our minds. Somebody has said something we don't like. John F. Kennedy, when he was president of the United States, said to his staff, we must forgive them, but don't forget their names. It's not very good. You see, when the wife says to the husband, I will remember that. Husband says to the wife, I heard what you said, I will remember that. And one puts it in their mind. Why do you keep it in your mind? Well, you're hoping a day or two later to quote back what was just said. Why would you do that? To shame them? To make them feel guilty? To make them squirm? Or so you can say, gotcha, gotcha. Look here. 1 Corinthians 13, love keeps no record of wrongs. I have to say that anybody watching me right now, your marriage is on the rocks, let's say. Your marriage is in a very, very unhealthy state. Would you believe it if I told you, if both of you, stop pointing the finger, your marriage could be saved by sundown tomorrow. That's how quickly. In fact, maybe sunrise tomorrow. If both of you would stop pointing the finger. Well, sometimes the husband will say, well, I will if she will. Or she says, I will if he will. You take what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5. He says, wives, be obedient to your husbands. And she says, well, I will when I feel love, because Paul goes on to say, husbands, love your wives. And you see, here's what happens with a marriage, merry-go-round. Husband says, I will love her when she submits, as a good wife should. She says, I will submit when I feel loved. And no one will get it right because you're waiting for the other. Here's my word, if you're willing to take it. If you could take this, if you're the husband, no matter what she's like, love her. Love her. Love her. Love keeps no record of wrongs. And I would say lovingly to the wife, it's not easy. Look here, I'm not saying this glibly, but if you would show the respect for your husband, even though you don't feel like it, do it as unto God. Your relationship with God will change. But in the perfect world, both stop it, keeping no record of wrong. But if one doesn't, if you do it by yourself, you will honor God, and you will come into the kind of love that Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 13. Live this way, you will never be sorry. And what is more, God has a plan for your life. What you've been earmarked for down the road, you will come into if you will manifest this kind of love. Well, that's it for today. See you next time.